Today, I'm sharing a quick tip that'll take your sewing from good to great. That is understitching and stay stitching. That will help you create the perfect curved seam. Understitching is stitching the seam allowance to the facing or the lining so it doesn't roll in. You don't see this on the outside. You only see a small line of stitching on the inside of the garment. This ensures a clean finish and ensures that the lining or facing stay in place, especially around curves. We use stay stitching on curves as well. Stay stitching is where we sew about an 1/8 inch from the edge inside the seam allowance before we start sewing anything else. This is what we do as soon as we cut out the fabric. We want to stay stitch in curved areas because they're going to be on the bias and they tend to stretch out. So when we're working with the fabric, those very, very delicate bias cut curved areas could be stretched out. When you stay stitch, the stitch lines prevent that from stretching. It's inside the seam allowance, so you never see it in the final garment. And I always stay stitch curved areas right after I cut out my fabric to prevent this distortion. I've sewn the neck curve at 1/4 inch, and before we do the understitching, we'll want to clip into the seam allowance up to but not through the stitching line. This allows the fabric to lay flat and prevents puckering. Then you turn right sides out. So recall the light blue solid is my lining, and this is the fashion fabric. So I'm going to go and iron this to allow the seam allowance to go towards the lining. So I'll iron that and then I'll be back. I ironed the seam allowance towards the lining, the solid colored lining. And then what we're going to do is turn it over. You can see slightly the seam allowance on that side. And I'm going to carefully stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line on the lining side, and that's going to catch in that seam allowance. Okay, you can see I stitched on the lining side. The light blue is the lining side. I stitched about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line. And you can see that the seam allowance is all caught up in there. And, my slashes where I, cut in here, that allowed it to spread open and not pucker in those really curved areas. And then what we will do is we're going to go press, and I'll finger press it here. So we just want to see just a little bit of the fashion fabric on the wrong side. So that this stitch line allows everything to roll into the inside. So when we have the outside of our garment, you will not see that lining. One thing we do not want to see, it's even hard for me to do, is we do not want to see that lining poking through like that. I'm having to really press hard to get it to do that because of that understitching. So I'm going to go press it and I'll come back and I'll show you what it looks like. I gave it a good press. You can see how beautiful the curve is. There's this nice crisp line. You just see no lining poking through. If you look at the wrong side, you can just see the line of stitching here on the lining side, but the stitching is not on the outer edge. And just on this lining side, you can see just a little bit of the fashion fabric poking through. When I iron it, I always want to make sure just a little bit that is coming on this side, and it's quite easy to do. It's actually the stitching sort of wants it to roll in. So there you go. Beautiful neckline. You can see me stay stitching here in the video where I create the flounce dress. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe as it really helps my small channel.